Good evening and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And tonight we'll be talking about some of the issues that plague Illinois and other states, pension reform, public unions, and how the two intersect, and how that really affects everyone in the state. Our guest tonight is Larry Spivack. He's the Regional Director of AFSCME Council 31 and the President of the Illinois Labor History Society. Larry, welcome back to the show.
I'm delighted to be here, Kevin.
And we should tell people that AFSCME is actually the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, correct?
Yep, we are the largest union in the AFL-CIO in Illinois. We represent about 70,000 workers of virtually every public sector there is, state being the largest, and we also represent people in the private sector who do primarily not-for-profit work in human services.
So let's jump right to the big issue. Pensions. That's all we read about. Pension shortfalls. We can't afford to keep funding, or not. We have not funded the pensions, therefore we can't afford to pay them. What's going on here? It seems from the layman's perspective that somehow the state has failed to fund these public pensions for years and years, decades perhaps, and now suddenly it's the fault of the employees. Am I reading that correctly, or is that?
I think that you stated it accurately insofar that there is a pension problem because the state used the pension to pay state services rather than smart politicians who funded their pension regularly. We have to remember from the very beginning that when people were hired into the public sector, the promise made to them was that they would pay a part of their salary and receive a defined pension benefit. The teachers pay 9% of their salary. Most of them don't get Social Security. And so they're thinking for 30, 35 years they're going to have some kind of safety net, a retirement, and these are public jobs. It's about the public life, serving the public, and state employees as well, and municipal employees, and police officers, and anybody in the public sector.
And I think it's important, if you allow me to interrupt you for a second, that these employees, in many cases, don't get Social Security.
That's correct.
So this pension is all they're going to have.
Well, a teacher in Illinois, the average pension after 34 years of service is $48,000 a year, no Social Security. So what you read in the newspapers that's driven by what I call the corporate agenda of this trashing of the public trust is really a handful of cases that usually are non-representative, not illustrative of all of the public sector. Most employees have contributed their entire life to pay their salary, just like most people who work also pay a tax on Social Security. Teachers is a higher amount because it goes right for the pension. And there is a public payment in kind that helps create an opportunity so that there at least would be hopefully a living wage. But if you're a state employee and work for 30 years, your average pension is between $20,000 and $30,000 a year after 30 years.
Non-teachers. You're talking the teacher's about 48.
Yeah,
a state employee,
right.
20
and
to
so,
30.
But it's not the kind of money that anybody reads about in those Tribune editorials, because the Tribune every day, it's their mission in life as part of the corporate agenda to try to show that we can't afford to pay public workers a pension, but of course we can. It's a question of how you want to fund a system, and in Illinois, for 40 years, we didn't fund it. Parties on both sides of the aisle, and then it had been decided as this so-called crisis was emerging, I call it a corporate crisis, who wanted more profit, started pushing the idea that just like the privatization of Social Security, we could make huge amounts of money if we privatize everything, and the pension is just drawing down the ability of Illinois to pay its bills. Well, why is it that we have one of the worst regressive tax systems in the entire country in Illinois? You put these things together and you build a system that doesn't work, that's flawed.
So given that the pensions haven't been funded, the argument I hear on the other side is that, yes, it may be true that the politicians were remiss in their duty and they didn't fund the pensions for decades, but now the reality, one way or another, like it or not like it, is that the money that should be there isn't, and therefore now we have this tremendous pension obligation, and that obligation simply cannot be met because the money just isn't there, and what are you going to do? You have to cut something.
There is no denial that there is a problem. none whatsoever. And in fact, most unions in Illinois, public and private, have gotten together and created a coalition along with other interest groups called the We Are One Coalition, and have put together proposals. And in fact, it seemed as if Senate President Cullerton was going to support something close to that, but politics being as they are, there seems to be such a desire to literally destroy the pension system of public employees, as this drive has been also a propaganda war against public employees for the last 10 years, so that now politicians are very comfortable to push the worst possible case scenario. Is it fixable? It is. If you look at the different plans that have been put out there, and there have been many, in terms of saving, and again, this isn't something that has to be fixed tomorrow or the next day. It's like Social Security. We look at 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. So how do you do that over time? And the proposals that have been put forward by the various unions, our union being in the forefront of it because our members are state university employees, as a large example, have a vested interest in continuing to have a defined pension benefit, and not just current employees, but future employees. Why would you want to go into this public service and do this kind of work if there is no future for retirement as is happening in the private sector? And so that becomes the debate. Well, the private sector no longer has pensions, so the public sector shouldn't. But
that's not logical. I mean, the fact that it has been dropped from one side of the equation doesn't mean you have to drop it from the other. Pensions, I think, were long seen as the reward for a long lifetime of working loyalty. This is no longer true today, but our parents' generation certainly grew up with the idea that you work for a company, you put in your time, your 30, 40 years, and you were entitled to a pension and to retire comfortably, perhaps not wealthy, but certainly a comfortable retirement.
Absolutely. And if you look at this issue, I keep calling it the corporate agenda. Take the people who are driving this, whether they, like the Illinois Policy Institute, ALEC,
the American Legislative Exchange Council,
yeah,
a think tank funded by
yeah,
corporate
or some
America.
of us call them stink tanks. You can look at the Commercial Club, the Civic Federation, the Commercial Club of Chicago. Well, the people who are driving this, Miles White from Abbott Labs, his $15 million a year, that's actually a small part of his compensation, or McNerney from Boeing, what is Boeing? But they basically take government money because most of their contracts they're a defense contractor.
So they're essentially paid
They'll
by
get
taxpayers.
$300,000 a year, and these are the guys that are pushing to get rid of pensions in the public sector, as they have done in their own sector for their employees, because it's a question of how can they suck more tax money for them in terms of profit. Over and over again, it's the same thing as privatization. It is a corporate agenda to drive down the standard of living by now going after the last unionized sector in America, where there are pensions, where you can squeeze people, and these are our teachers, these are our public hospital employees, these are those who take care of the mentally ill, these are prison guards in the small towns.
Is it also police and firefighters?
Police and firefighters. And so the attack on the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund is yet to be out there as greatly, because that'll be next. That one is well funded, and the IMRF, as we call it in Illinois, actually works. It's 98% funded or 96% funded because it was properly managed. So we agree. We have already proposed numerous changes to the pension system, but is it fair to say that you're going to cut a person's pension that's worked for 30 years or 40 years by 30%, which is what it would amount to under the plan that House President Madigan is pushing? And our understanding is that come December 3rd, they're bringing the four groups together, the four leaders, to push for, again, another big cut in the pension, which they haven't succeeded in doing because there are 800-something thousand people in Illinois who are recipients of public pensions currently.
It's a lot of votes.
Yes, and people who have given and dedicated their lives. So what you do is you create an enemy. You all of a sudden, instead of doing what they do in other countries where education is admired, we say, our teachers don't work hard, our teachers are lazy, our teachers
getting a free ride.
Yes, don't deserve it. And yet Imagine if that's where we were investing our money. I'm not sure if I understand, if I want a quality of life, why I would not want to pay a preschool teacher a living wage. And so there are all these movements now that are springing up on this question because America is so far down on the totem pole compared to the rest of the developed world that it's become a question of, can you even get a quality education? Not because of bad teachers, but who would want to ever go into teaching? Who would want to be a preschool teacher for $9 an hour? We know that Head Start gives people an opportunity. And yet, for America, the corporate ideal in our state is profit is everything and people come second.
But it's ultimately, it's self-defeating. Henry Ford realized a century ago when he was building cars that he had to pay his workers enough wages so that they could buy the cars that his plant was making. And that equation, that fundamental equation, is still true in the United States. If there is no middle class, or if there aren't enough people who can consume what the corporations make, their earnings will drop because people can't buy what they make.
Well, this is kind of not just a contradiction in the system, but the ethos of corporate America. I call it the pathos, really, because you will cut your own throat in order to make that 90-day profit margin. It's always about the next 90 days. There's no long-term thinking. And in Europe, it's very, very different. Even corporations there operate on a different basis. Of course, they're in the business of making money. Henry Ford, though, knew he could not make money because that's what he wanted to do. Did he fight when the union finally came in to organize? Of course he did. But he did understand that as a consumer, you have to be able to purchase things. And wages have been down for 35 years now. Since 1979, wages have declined in America. Most people don't realize that because now they're working 4,000 hours a year instead of 2,000 hours a year. This is the society that we want. You're not going to have time to take care of your kids. Back in the 19th century, the ideal was 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours for what we will. And that became the 8-hour day movement, and we're fighting for that again.
Let's come back to pensions for a minute. Part of what we hear is that people live much longer than they used to. And so the actuarial models on which these pensions were built, it's leaving aside the underfunding, were wrong. And that now people retire, and particularly public employees can retire at the age, sometimes the age of 50, after 30 years of work, and then live to be 80 or 90. So the idea would be that they work for 30 years and get paid in retirement for 30 or 40. And that equation, I think, is what certainly we hear that and read that in the papers. Where does that lie? I mean, how true is that, and how much of a problem is that? Is that central to this argument at all, or is it a red herring?
Oh, I don't think it's a red herring, and I don't think it's central to the argument. I think that it's a factor. We know in Social Security you make some adjustments. Social Security, turns out that despite the fact that we talk about the average age of a man living to be I think it's in America 76 or 78. It depends on many factors, whether you're going to be 78 or you're going to be 82. But in terms of collecting Social Security, it's really not a very long period of time. Actuarially, it's really not.
Well, but Social Security, you have to wait longer. You can't collect that at the age of 50.
Well, correct, although most pensioners don't collect their pension until they are, even in the public sector, given the rules. While in Illinois you had the rule of 85, you had to have a combination of service plus age of 85. Very few people would be 50 years old, and only law enforcement, which has always, for many decades, been considered, a different value for pension earning, is 50, like the military. But in terms of the typical teacher, it's 30 to 35 years of service. The typical state employee, 30 to 35 years of service, and people are not getting their pensions, their full pension, till they're in their 60s. Actuarially,
so even under the current system, if you retire at 55, you wouldn't, even if you had 30 years of service, you might not necessarily get your full pension until you reach 65. Is that correct?
You would be less. You could be eligible for a full pension, but if you were only there for 30 years, you're not going to get as much as if you worked for 35 years. So, the point is that in any of these public systems, to get to a place where, in not state university particularly, or teachers, but municipal employees, if you're really looking at 34 years to 35 years to get to a level where your retirement will give you enough replacement income to give you at least a decent, an okay minor standard of living. We are talking about modest beyond what most people believe. We're not talking about the $175,000 a year
Those
mayor
exist, right?
who now collects 3 pensions, and there's 180 people in Illinois that they've found have this out of the 800,000. But those are the ones that the Tribune wants to publish every single day. So, but to your central question of people live longer, yes. Does that mean there have to be modifications? Yes. But they don't have to be that you cut people's pension by 30%. It's just wrong. It's immoral.
Well, and let's come to the contractual point as well. These pension agreements are actually binding contracts entered into willingly by both the unions and the government sectors.
And by
right?
the Constitution of Illinois, and I guarantee you that the day after, whether it's Madigan or the Illinois General Assembly put forward a pension that is not an agreed upon bill, that there will be lawsuits, and they'll spend millions and millions of dollars on lawsuits, and they'll have to, because there's going to be so many people that are going to be out of their mind, rightfully so, that they're going to have their cost of living adjustments taken away. We know that one of the key factors in being able to at least live to get by is a cost of living adjustment. If you don't have that, anybody that does math and does retirement understands that. That's always talked about in terms of...
And it's pegged usually to the consumer price index, some recognized measure of inflation.
Right, and so that's why I say that they're talking about cuts of 30%, because you start cutting the cost of living adjustment in 20 years, if you do live 20 years, and you're looking at 3 or 4% inflation a year, do the math. You're looking at a cost of living of 30, 40, 60%.
Well, actually, it's compounded, so it's larger than that.
Of course.
Right.
And the magic of compounding is something when you save, but the magic of compounding also affects you if you aren't.
If you're on the wrong side of that,
That's correct.
It's just as magical,
Right.
but the outcome is not
Right.
very desirable.
I think, while I may sound like I'm simplifying it, these are very fixable. These are issues in our public policy.
So
Why?
what are if the fixes are straightforward, what are they?
Well, the fixes are that you close corporate loopholes and you raise revenue in the state. So, for instance, we had
Now,
a temporary tax increase, amounts to $5 billion a year, and it's about to sunset. If we don't keep that going, that's another loss of $5 billion. What we've been doing in Illinois is paying state government through the borrowing from the pension system. Why don't we have, like 35 other states, a more progressive tax? They don't have this problem in New York. The pensions in New York are very well funded, the public pensions. This is an Illinois problem. It's a problem that is pushed in other states, but you get a progressive tax system where if you make a lot more money, as opposed to 2 out of 3 corporations in Illinois don't pay state taxes. We know there's hundreds of $billions of lost revenue in this country, just on a larger scale. There was a time when corporate America contributed to 28% of the federal tax revenue. It's down to 7%. You and I make that up.
So now the argument on the other side of that is, though, that corporations, which are far more mobile than they used to be, can pick and choose where they do business in any state or outside the country as well. But states now compete against each other.
ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, one of the largest corporations in the country. There was certainly, 5 corporations control 80% of the food production. ADM in Decatur, Illinois, wants to move its corporate headquarters to Chicago, but they want a $124 million incentive because they don't even qualify for tax breaks because they don't pay state taxes. Most of these large corporations don't pay state taxes, but we can, so we should. It is, again, about greed. It's about profit. It's about Wall Street. It's about a very few number of people, the 1% that control 30 to 40% of all wealth in this country, and the 10% that control about 80 to 90% of all wealth in this country. America's not broke. Illinois is not broke. It's a matter of how we choose to distribute it.
Well, when you say Illinois is not broke, I mean the budget is such that the revenues don't match the expenditures at this point. Is it your contention, though, that when you say that the state is not broke, that because the state controls revenues and can raise taxes, that therefore they could make this up How you?
Over a period of time, there's no shortage of, we talk about think tanks, we talk about other groups that look at it from a quality of life perspective, not just for rich people. Although they would say, oh, this is about everybody else, and they're paying for the few public employees that are eating from the trough of the system. We know that we can raise revenue through a progressive tax system, billions of dollars. We know that we could cut billions of dollars of tax loopholes if we wanted to in corporations. And in fact, why should a corporation be allowed to go to another state? Is it because corporations are considered persons under the Constitution, that therefore they don't have to...
But you're not suggesting that the state would intervene and not allow a corporation to move to another state, are you?
I'm saying that perhaps we should let them... if a corporation... this should be a federal issue, in my opinion. I mean, I think that it's like so many things. The race to the bottom is an international problem. Mm-hmm. Corporations are global. There is now a global solution to this. The U.S. never subscribes to the International Labor Organization and the rules of labor law, for instance. The United States has the weakest labor laws in the developed world. There's a reason.
So is it your suggestion that the federal government could create a structure where a corporation would not, would not be allowed to move from one state to another just to get a tax advantage? Is that a suggestion?
I would say that would be a real good suggestion. I would say that Illinois should tell ADM, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And everybody else, because they're not all going to go to Indianapolis. In Indianapolis, we shouldn't be fighting state over state. These are public policy issues that should be pushed at state governments by progressive politicians to say, in all states, we're going to unite to stop this holding hostage. You know, right now, they just go offshore. The $1 trillion that we're not collecting in revenue because you could go offshore.
But how would that happen? I mean, the states... Many of them have very conservative legislatures. I mean, how would you get this kind of this nationwide movement of states coming together to work on a progressive agenda when the majority of the states, in fact, have conservative legislatures?
Well, again, 35 states have a more progressive tax than Illinois. And so I think it becomes, as always, a question of education. The propaganda, the billions of dollars spent on propaganda to convince average working people to vote against their own self-interest is something that's very difficult to overcome. We don't have Fox News. We don't have as I said, the Tribune will write an anti-worker editorial every day of its life if it can. It's founded on those principles for all practical purposes, regardless of what they say. And so, although people read newspapers less, the funding comes from the very, very wealthy for all these kinds of policies that are then written into law. So that might argue for your point that it's hard to do. Of course it is, but these are the things that the people in Illinois that have gotten elected, if it's a Democratic legislature, they should be talking about this. But part of the problem is the structure of not so much that there aren't good people in government, but that the way the leadership works in Illinois government is it's a dynasty and a dinosaur, whether Republican or Democrat.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because generally labor issues are associated with the Democratic Party, and we have an overwhelmingly Democratic government in Illinois. Why isn't it happening? Why aren't the Democrats in Springfield signing up for this kind of agenda? What's going on?
I think that one of the things that we're seeing more and more is that, as a labor history person, I talk about Lucy Parsons talked about this 150 years ago. It's money that rules people, not votes. And so the Citizens United is a great example. This could be one of the worst things for America, because more and more the money that will control political decisions, or just the ego of, say, the House of Representatives, Mike Madigan, being able to control the money of who gets what position and how much they get in their district, and if you need $500,000 to run for state representative, in order to even have a shot, then it's all about money. And that's more and more what's become the case. I say we take the money, that kind of money, out of the electoral process, but this question of a so-called Democratic Labor Alliance, it's loose, it's not real tight, it's not like it once was. It's not like Cook County and labor. There was a labor coalition that when people will vote the right way, the labor coalition will say, then we will support you. My union supported Rod Blagojevich, and then not only is in jail in the first election,
Right.
but then a year later we were saying we want him out of office. Quinn, we supported him, and then all of a sudden the politics changed. And so, if they had a good voting record or they say the right things, we have an obligation to support people who say they're going to support us. If they don't, then we're not going to support them. There isn't necessarily a monolithic view from the labor perspective about every single issue, because some are private sector, some are public sector, some are specifically teachers, some are specifically law enforcement. And so sometimes we have our own differences, but there is a coalition that does stand united against these pension changes, and we call that the We Are One. And there's another coalition that includes most of the labor unions, and we're calling that a Better Illinois. And in fact, we believe that small businesses are supporting this idea of a Better Illinois for a progressive tax that would be a constitutional amendment to change the tax structure. So I know these are the kind of issues that make it hard for the average citizen to I'm not saying can't understand, but they're convoluted by the idea that we're broke, when in fact it's just a question of how you allocate resources. Every budget is an allocation of resources.
So how would the how would the progressive tax work?
Well, right now in Illinois, there's a flat tax. Everybody's income tax is X percent, and I think that as we've seen in other states, even though it may be useful to tax certain services and to raise revenue, if you make, if you're in the top 2% making $250,000, you might very well pay a higher tax rate. There was a time in America when the wealthiest Americans paid 91% tax rate.
Yeah, people don't remember that. That was
91%.
It was after World War II.
Yes, and actually it was yes, and now it's 36%. It went down to like 34%, then under Clinton it went up a little bit. And in fact, somehow we ended up with a deficit. We went from this huge deficit to this incredible surplus. Now there are many reasons for that. This has happened in Illinois. Last year, revenue in Illinois rose $327 million above what we expected. So it was, or this year, it's running at that kind of rate. So again, these are people decisions, political decisions, but politicians who are running all the time, they're always running for election, are looking for ways to be liked by the leadership, not go against the leadership. That you get slated that way, you get support that way. It's hard to win against that.
So,
and
I hate to cut you off, but we're about out of time. So I understand the message is go vote, understand what you're voting for and who you're voting for. And that's where change begins, right?
That's one important place where it begins.
Larry, thank you so much for being on the show. Appreciate you coming back, and we'll have you again soon.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and you can see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. Till next time, thank you and good night.